For those of you that don't know me, I am McClenahan. I am in the master's program for diversity, equity, and inclusion here at Rowan. And all semester I've been focusing on perceived gender inequalities within Rowan athletics. So a little bit about me. I graduated from Rowan with my undergrad in law and justice and sociology in May of 2022. I began my master's program the next fall in 2022, and I am supposed to be finishing up next week, hopefully. I was a member of the women's track and field team from fall 2018 until May 2023. I'm currently a volunteer hurdle coach at my high school, and I am the oldest of 4 girls. One of my little sisters is here today. Okay. I first want to start with a few terms that I'll be using throughout the presentation, just so everyone has a general understanding of what I'm talking about. So the first acronym is the NCAA. It's the National Collegiate Athletic Association, which is a nonprofit organization that regulates athletics around 1,000 schools across the United States. The next term is Title IX, which is a law that was passed in 1972, and it protects people from sex discrimination in educational programs and activities that receive federal funding. I also will be talking about gender bias, which is favoritism toward prejudice against a particular gender. So one of my first memories of playing sports, besides telling my dad that the sweatiest I've ever been was after my first soccer game, was being told that I run like a girl. My 8-year-old self thought it was a compliment, but it wasn't until years later I found out it was supposed to be an insult. Being the oldest of 4 girls who surrounded their lives around sports made me extremely passionate about women and girls in sports, and it drove me to examine gender inequalities that female athletes at Rowan may experience. So not only is this research important to me personally, it's important because NCAA D3 athletes don't receive any kind of athletic scholarship, which means they voluntarily participate and are not linked to any monetary compensation. This means that they're more inclined to quit if they're not satisfied with their own program. When I was going through previous literature, I found that there was no research on Division III. It was mainly on professional sports or Division I. And I also found that in this literature, gender bias perpetuates stereotypes that can be extremely discouraging, both mentally and physically. So after going through my literature, I came up with 3 research questions. The first was, do female athletes at Rowan University experience gender-related bias? The second being, how does gender bias impact female athletes at Rowan University? And third, what resources are in place to assist these athletes? Considering my research questions, my goals for this project were to identify perceived differences between male and female athletes at Rowan University, evaluate the differences and determine if they affect females negatively, and address the findings with administration in an effort to make female athletes' experiences better. Along with my research questions, these goals led me to my hypothesis. My hypothesis is broken down into 2 parts. The first being, female athletes at Rowan University experience gender bias affecting their overall well-being within the athletic environment. The second part is, the implementation of increased resources and inclusivity initiatives will lead to a more supportive and equitable athletic environment, positively impacting the overall well-being of female athletes. So how did I conduct this research? I took a series of 7 steps. The first being finding already existing conceptual frameworks, then recognizing my population and sample size, recruiting these participants, conducting interviews, transcribing these interviews, analyzing all of the data, and finally figuring out how to address these findings. I started my process by examining 2 already existing conceptual frameworks. I began with the feminist theory created by Mary Wollstonecraft. In this theory, she examines the issues of inequalities that are gender-based and considers the role of the family in perpetuating male dominance. The second theory I looked at is the social conflict theory that was coined by Karl Marx. In this theory, he argues that there is a struggle for dominance among social groups, such as men versus women. According to the social conflict theory, social problems are created when dominant groups, the men, exploit or oppress subordinate groups, the women. Within this theory, men are seen as the dominant gender and the women are seen as the subordinate. So after considering these two theories, I then needed to find my population and sample size. My target population were female athletes who were on the women's teams that had coexisting male teams at Rowan. Therefore, I only spoke to athletes on the basketball, soccer, softball, swimming, and track and field teams. I chose to focus on teams that had coexisting male teams because it allows for a more direct comparison to the male teams here. There's approximately 140 total female athletes within these 5 teams. So then that brings me to my sample size. My goal was between 15 to 30 athletes, which would be about 10 to 18% of the total population of 140 females. I estimated that my point of saturation, which is when the answers will not be generating new responses, would be reached at around 25 participants. I had 19 females consent to participate. However, only 16 of those 19 completed interviews, which came to be about 12% of my total population. I utilized 2 methods of recruitment to contact participants. The first is the snowball method. In this method, it's a recruitment technique where the research participants are asked to assist researchers in identifying other potential subjects. The next method I use is convenience sampling. This is a sampling method where participants are selected for inclusion in the sample because they are the easiest for the researcher to access. Being a former athlete at this university made it easier for me to reach out to these athletes, as a lot of them have known me personally for years. I began reaching out to potential participants by emailing the listed captains on the basketball, soccer, softball, swimming, and track and field teams on the Rowan Athletics website, which is a public website, and requested a list for active participants, as sometimes the online rosters are not completely accurate. I then emailed these individuals a study overview and a link to a Qualtrics form, which is an online survey software, where they consented to participate and answered a series of questions that filtered inclusion criteria, such as identifying as a female and being a current member of one of the 5 teams. Once they consented to participate in an in-person focus group, they then chose a scheduled date and time. The interviews took place in a pre-booked study room that took place in Campbell Library, right on campus. There was a total of 7 interviews that took around 30 to 60 minutes. And in these groups, there were groups of 2 to 4 participants. However, later in the process, they turned into one-on-one interviews due to limited availability of participants. Each participant consented to being audio recorded through voice memos, and they were asked a series of 15 semi-structured questions that allowed them to tell their own lived experiences. I allowed the participants to tell their own stories or narratives, which allowed me to find common themes throughout the concept called thematic narrative. Thematic narrative uses stories as a tool to explore identity construction and embodied experiences. It also is the idea that individual stories can be analyzed through an inductive process to identify themes. To find these themes, I used a 6-step process that Peel explains to be familiarization of data, initial coding, generating themes, reviewing those themes, defining and naming them, and conducting analysis. However, I like this flowchart a little bit better because it visually explains the organization of themes by using different colors and coding them like that. And it also includes a much-needed ice cream break. I uploaded the voice memos to Otter AI, which is an online transcription service, and then removed all personal identifiers and replaced them with a unique 3-digit code that Qualtrics generated for me. Then I went through the transcription and highlighted any meaningful statements, and then coded these statements by that same 3-digit code. All of the themes that I found stem from the same 5 questions. These questions were centered around specific stories they remembered about gender bias at Rowan, what kind of impact they had, how they coped with situations involving gender bias, how they have been supported, or lack of support, and lastly, if they ever had any discussions or trainings related to DEI and if they had worked. After analyzing the responses from every interview, I came up with 4 main themes. The first theme was proving oneself. 43% of these participants expressed that they felt they needed to prove themselves as an athlete. One of the athletes was quoted saying, "I think that women don't get recognized unless they win." Another said, "Females just want the same opportunities, like they play and they work and they train just as hard as the men, if not sometimes even harder, trying to prove themselves and showing that they're just as good at their sport as men are." The next theme I found was using a negative as a positive. 37% indicated using negative experiences as a form of motivation. One of the athletes said, "It does make us work harder and all these positive things because of all the negativity. You just have to get past that in order to grow." Another said, "I know that they're going to push me harder and they're going to make me stronger mentally and physically." She was referring to her male counterparts in that one. So the third theme is positive team support. 56% of the participants admitted that they use their teammates as a resource to cope with challenges, including gender bias. One of the athletes said, "Me and my girls, we kind of complain about it together and we just low-key bond over it." Another said, "As a group, we bounce off of each other and we get over it together. Not get over it, we come together and we pick each other up." And lastly, the last theme I found was need for improved training and inclusivity. Half of the participants argued that they needed better training on inclusivity and Title IX. Two of the participants were discussing amongst themselves, and one said, "The meetings, they do kind of coat things through, they're checking something off a box. They're we follow these things. Title IX, check. Gender equality, check. Sign this paper, check." Near the end of the interviews, I had asked, and after I had heard them all express themselves, I asked 2 questions asking for their recommendations on improvement. These 2 questions were, what recommendations or changes would you propose to reduce or eliminate gender bias in sports at Rowan? And, in your opinion, what role should the university athletic department, coaches, and teammates play in creating a more inclusive sports environment? The athletes suggesting having more individualized meetings with administrators. They were quoted saying, maybe taking time to sit down with the captains and be like, "What are some things that you think need to be addressed this year? Do you feel like this? Do you need this?" And then after hearing them talk about it, maybe find a solution, because I think they're willing to hear it, but they're not willing to act on it. Another argued that maybe having the captains talk with administration, that could work. Another said being a constant resource and someone that anyone could be able to go to with any problem or even suggestions too. And lastly, they said keeping people accountable and really listening to the athletes. Another suggestion from the athletes was to hold more social events. One of the participants said it wouldn't be that bad, just shove people into the deep end to socialize. Another said, I think maybe just hosting events more than just the backyard barbecue in the beginning, that was the only event where all teams got together. And lastly, they suggested maybe having combined Title IX meetings. One female recognized the importance of having the men and women separate during Title IX meetings, but also suggested that having combined meetings would be good because she thought that there's a value in women hearing the men's perspective on things, and there's a value in the men hearing women's perspective on things. Taking all these ideas into consideration, I came up with my own recommendations as a researcher. I think administration should provide more resources and trainings to reduce gender-based discrimination in college athletics. A few years back, there was a group called OWL, which stood for Outstanding Women Leaders, which allowed female athletes to communicate with each other and become better leaders. I believe something like this should be re-implemented. I also think there should be more mental health counseling service, not just for the athletes, but for the administration and coaches and everyone that comes in contact with this population. I believe that Title IX meetings that are held every year are very beneficial, and they do a great job of explaining what Title IX is, but they're seen as a chore, and it is crammed into a very stressful time of year, usually during move-in, and it is often forgotten by the spring semester. So I believe there should be more than one spread throughout the year, and possibly even having a combined meeting so that all athletes can have an empathetic understanding of each other in this sort of context. I also think that there should be more resources in DEI training outside of this university. There should be online trainings that are optional for everyone, not just athletes, but coaches as well. Another recommendation that I have is to improve inclusivity by utilizing already established groups and clubs. The Student Athlete Advisory Committee, also known as SAC, has really good initiatives such as the Prof Cup, which is a competition between the teams to encourage each other to go support at games and meets. However, being in those environments, I have noticed that these teams still segregate themselves and they sit separately. I think there should be more of an effort to sit together and cheer on everyone as a collective. I also think that there should be more events throughout the year, whether it be a formal or some kind of social gathering where everyone is invited and no one is excluded would be great, or having more opportunities in homecoming as well. When it comes to any kind of research, there is always going to be limitations. One of the limitations I found in my research is having a narrow population. Since I only looked at women's teams with coexisting male teams, I cannot speak to Rowan's women's volleyball or lacrosse team since Rowan does not have a men's team for them. The total female population, including every single sport that women can compete in, is around 300 athletes, while my population is only 140, which is about 46% of the total population. I also specifically only focused on Rowan University for convenience, and not all Division III schools. I was also limited to only one semester, and after I got approved, I only had about a month to collect all of my data. So in conclusion, it was found that most of the female athletes interviewed experienced or could recognize gender bias within Rowan. These athletes felt that they had a strong support system with their teammates and could easily turn their hardships into motivation. They could recognize the efforts put in by administrators, but have a few suggestions for improvements revolving around communication. And lastly, this research is important to understand the athletes and their experiences to ensure an overall pleasant experience. So I just wanted to take this time to express my heartfelt gratitude to my cohort, to Professor Britt, and everyone that supported me throughout my whole journey the last 3 semesters. I want to thank my parents, my teammates, my friends. Thank you all for coming, and I am really happy that I finished. And lastly, I would like to thank my sisters who have showed me it's a compliment to run like a girl.